Hey there, I'm Vasco, your host, and today we have quite a special episode for you. If you've looked at your podcast player, you will have noticed that this episode is quite a bit longer than usual, but that's a good thing though. Today we interview a tech leader. It can be a CTO, a VP of engineering, the kind of people we tend to work with in leadership teams. We are in the CTO series of episodes here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, and this series collects first-person accounts of what it is to lead tech organizations so that we, Scrum Masters and Agile coaches, can learn about their struggles, their goals, but also what they've succeeded with and how. So grab a cup of coffee or go for a walk, and make sure you check the show notes after listening to this episode, as all of those incredibly important lessons you don't want to lose will be right there, documented for your benefit. For now, let's dive into the universe of tech leaders and learn how we can help them. So come on with me. Let's listen. Hello, everybody. Welcome to one more episode of this very special CTO series. We have with us, joining us from the US, Andrea Goulet. Hey, Andrea, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you. And I'm really excited to talk about one of the key topics that you bring to our Agile and software world, as Andrea, mispronounced it there. Andrea is on a mission to change the way the world thinks about empathy by leading a scientific revolution and making empathy a core technical skill for all technologies. I can see many Scrum Masters already say, yes, yes. She's a sought-after international keynote speaker, experienced software entrepreneur, and award-winning industry leader. Her expertise centers on using empathy and effective communication, to modernize legacy and mission-critical software systems. Andrea has taught over 75,000 students through her online courses on empathy and communication. And she's also authoring a book called Empathy-Driven Software Development, which I'm very interested in. And she's also the founder of Empathy in Tech and Legacy Code Rocks, two online communities where code and compassion connect. It's very interesting to have you here to talk about code and compassion, software and empathy. So the first question is actually very interesting for me, which is, what was that pivotal moment in your career, Andrea, that kind of defined your approach to leadership and technology in the way that you do today?
Yeah, I think, I got started in the industry. I have a background actually in strategic communications. So I had a lot of courses on psychology and communications and, how to do market research. And there's a lot of technical aspects of empathy that go into that profession. And reconnected with a friend when I was in my late 20s. He wanted to start a business he didn't know what yet, but he wanted to build software products. And we figured out that he loves working on legacy code. His name's Scott Ford. And it just kind of worked, where I came on as his CEO to help him build the business, and we were rocking and rolling. But we kind of needed to figure out what our business did. So we hired a business consultant to kind of help us with some strategic planning, map out our core values, that kind of stuff. And the one that we were very clear on was empathy, like act with empathy. Empathy had to be the core of our DNA. It had to be the core of everything we did. But this one consultant laughed and said, no, you can't do that. We were like, what? And she said, if you say the word empathy and software in the same sentence, you will be laughed out of the industry. And we were like, well, we're already trying to position ourselves as menders who love fixing legacy code. So, what's one more thing to be laughed about? And that was the moment where I was like, hold my tea, hold my beer, hold whatever. This is a problem. I know enough where I think I can figure this out, and I can absolutely make empathy a core cultural touch point and a technical skill with our team. And yeah, there were other core values that we developed. Communication is just as important as code, calm the chaos, craft in context, and just those really made a difference, but it required us to kind of let go of some of the preconceived notions of what a effective software boutique consulting firm looked like.
So you were in the software consulting business at that time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you were trying to craft a message that would kind of demonstrate to your potential clients what your company could bring to them. And you braved the warning and used empathy. How did those first conversations go when you were actually talking to potential customers and you were using that word? Did you get left out of the room?
We did not at all. They would read our website and still do. And they're like, do you actually do this? This sounds amazing. This is the way I have always wanted to work. So, yeah, it was really interesting. And then, when I started trying to keynote, I knew that like we wanted to go to conferences and speak on podcasts to kind of build our business. So I pitched at a few different places and, highlighted my experience doing strategic communications with companies like the Smithsonian and things like that. And just put together a talk called Communication is Just as Important as Code. And it was very quickly like, will you keynote? And .NET Fringe in 2016, I attended that, which was a great conference. Scott Hanselman was in the audience. And I shared some ways that Scott and I, because I came from a very stereotypical business background, and Scott he has his degree in computer science. So we absolutely had to figure out how to work together. And empathy is the thing that enables us to do that. From an evolutionary perspective, empathy is what drives us to collaborate and work together. So we got to get good at it.
And of course, many of our listeners will wholeheartedly agree with you. But there's a point in everybody's career, and I don't know what that point was for you. Maybe it was when you were studying communications. But when did you figure out that, wait a minute, there's an ingredient missing? That's why we're running into problems. What is that ingredient? That ultimately led you to discover that empathy was that ingredient. But what was that moment when you went like, aha, there's something missing here?
Yeah, it was when I had come from an environment where, professionally, working at a communications company, you just interrupt people. It's very context switching. You swing by somebody's desk and just go, hey, you got a sec? And people would say no. They're like, no, ping me at the end of the day, or, I'll catch up with you tomorrow. But that was just, people would set their own boundaries and communicate that way and organize how to, connect at different points. So I was relatively new to Agile. And so, when Scott and I were working together, a couple of years at this point, and I was working with the clients, and there was a client that had a issue that I really needed Scott's expertise in it. And one of the Agile principles was the last responsible moment, right? So not wanting to overplan. But with this particular client, I genuinely felt that it was the last responsible moment. And I needed to interrupt Scott, and he had his headphones on. And so I was like, okay, how do I do this? I know he needs deep focus. So I very sheepish, we were working in the same location. So I snuck up and very demure. It was just like, hi, you got a sec? And he daggone near flipped the table. I did not know what I had done, but it was a visceral reaction of just something. And from my perspective, part of me, that my instinct was, what's wrong with you? Why? Seriously, I've never seen anybody else do this. Why? I'm really trying to work with you. I'm trying to be respectful, right? I did not do that. I paused, took a deep breath, and I said, okay, we're going to have to work together. And this is a problem that we're going to experience over and over and over again. So we need to figure out how to do elegant interruptions, because you can't just be in your headphones for a week and never interact with clients. We don't have the infrastructure for that. We're two people at this point. And I said, I don't know what I did, but I care about this company. I care about us. and I don't want to mess up again. So I need to understand what just happened. And the movie Inception from Chris Nolan had just come out. And he said, I was 9 Inception layers down. And part of my job is building these kind of crystal palace mental models in my head. And I had spent 3 days working on this problem, and I was so close to fixing it. And I could not hold the mental model and ask and figure out how to answer your question, because you got a sec. It's not actually a second. So I need to evaluate, okay, is it 5 minutes, 20 minutes? How close am I to being done? And he said, just doing the analysis to even answer the question broke all of my mental models, just like the streets of Paris fold over. And now it's going to take me 3 hours to get back. And it's a lot of emotional work. And like, I had no idea, right? And I'm sure this is a very common experience, because when I speak at conferences, people are like, yeah. So the challenge I found is it's a mismatched mental model, because for me, my experience, it was like, oh yeah, this is just natural. Here's how we communicate. Context switching was normal. I hadn't encountered the need for somebody to go that deep. So we went, and now that I understood it, we went and had lunch and figured out, like, okay, well, what are some ways that we can solve this problem? This is an immediate problem right in front of us. And so went through a whole bunch of different ideas, but we ended up saying, what if I just said the word inception and then you labeled it? Could you give a number just to say, like, 9, don't interrupt me, or 2, and then I know you'll be available relatively soon. He's like, oh, I could do that. That's not too much mental load, because I can label that, but still keep my mental model. So we tried it, and it changed everything. Everything. We didn't have that problem anymore. And
Wow. So basically what you did there was, by stepping back and instead of saying, what's wrong with you, going like, okay, I don't know how to do this. I need your help, because we obviously need to interrupt each other, but we need to do it when it's the right time. But how can we find the right time, right? Let's talk about it. And what I heard you say is that, okay, so we needed to create a whole new language for this very short, low mental load queries to, can I interrupt you, right?
Yeah. And I've seen this work over and over and over again. And so, in the process of spending the past 3 years really diving deep into the science of empathy, which we have a whole bunch of new research since around 2011, 12, 13. They started just releasing funding floodgates. So now we have so much more data on what empathy is and how to use it effectively. And so my goal is to kind of synthesize it. So then that way we've got a schematic, and we know here's how to, like, effectively empathize in a domain agnostic, situation agnostic way. So what I learned is that the core skill of empathy is what's called a reappraisal. And this is a psychological term that means stop and pause and think before you act. So that place between impulse and action. And this is a skill. This is not something most people do naturally. It's something you have to definitely practice. But when you can, that's the first step. And that's exactly what I did with Scott. When we look at empathy, there's actually what I call a structured reappraisal. I call these kind of the rules of the road, right? This is similar to how starlings figure out how to fly in a formation, right? This is how we learn to navigate with each other. And there's some really cool stuff that I won't go into here because we don't have enough time. But empathy actually follows the same dynamics of a complex dynamic adaptive system that we use to modernize legacy code. So there are so many like computational things that uphold these. And when you're already familiar with those types of principles, it translates really well. So the structured reappraisal, when you pause, is that I've described is collect, connect, communicate. So the first thing you do is you collect yourself, you center yourself in your own experience, right? You think about, are you mad? You look at the situation. What are my biases, right? But just a quick check-in, and emotionally regulate. Then you connect. You think about the other person, the person that you're trying to communicate with, you're trying to understand. You imagine things from their point of view, but you mostly assess like what data don't you have too, because you're never going to have complete data set of all of the things that are going wrong. So approaching it more like a hypothesis where, okay, I think this is how it is, but I don't know. And that's the huge shift in how we think about empathy. Culturally, we think of empathy as an inference and treating that inference as kind of some pseudo-psychic ability. It's not that.
Yeah.
It's being able to infer, but then go, hey, get feedback on it. Like it's continuous learning.
So that sounds like what I've heard called show up with curiosity. Is that what you mean? Like be curious about, and I mean curious in the sense of wanting to understand the experience of the other person.
Yep. Absolutely. So this is like curiosity. Adam Grant has a great book, Think Again, that kind of goes into the ideas of reappraisals in a little bit more detail. But yeah, curiosity, humility, but rather than just kind of succumbing to our confirmation bias and not being willing to be open to learning, like this is where it happens. And it happens a whole bunch throughout the day. Like this is just the thing that you're doing. So, the reason I call it empathy-driven development, because it's kind of like red-green refactor. You're just constantly doing that. And by the process of constantly doing that and writing the unit tests, like things emerge, right? So same with collect, connect, communicate. Once you have I know what I have a message I think I want to say. I have a sense of kind of what I like infer, but I'm not going to treat that as fact. And then you decide what is the message that I could send that has the least amount of opportunities for miscommunication. And so again, computationally, there's a bunch of really cool stuff around Claude Shannon and entropy and like, I wish I could nerd out about it, but it's there, right? And the more I have looked in this empathy research, it's like, this is how we maintain healthy software systems. So this is a teachable thing, and there's a lot of associative learning that if you know some of these other concepts, you can absolutely latch onto it. So collect, connect, communicate is kind of the practical thing that you do throughout the day.
And this, of course, will be described in further detail in Empathy-Driven Software Development, the book that you are writing.
That's the core of the book.
For those of you that are interested, is there like a beta book page, a preview book page that they could go to?
I'm working on it right now. So you can go to AndreaGoulet.com. That's going to be the place where it will be housed. I have a few different places here and there, but the big thing for the past 3 years has just been wrapping my brain around the research, because it pretty much broke all of my assumptions of what I thought empathy was. Like, I identified as an empath prior. I've been told I'm really good at breaking the ice and reading a room. And now I realize that I was actually conforming to a stereotype. If you look at like Deanna Troi on, Star Trek, for example, there's a great researcher, Jamil Zaki, who actually has coined the Roddenberry hypothesis, where we have empathy identities, but they're more based in pop culture. So I identified as an empath, but what I've since learned is that I was really operating out of hubris. I was walking in and saying, oh, I know how you feel, and sometimes feeling like I knew how somebody felt better than they did. And I'm not proud of it, but the cool thing is that there's differences, not deficits.
So this is actually a very good point. And it's important to talk about this difference. Showing up with empathy is different from knowing what other people are feeling. And I realize that, as you were describing it, I've been in therapy for many years, and I think all people who work with other people should go through therapy to understand themselves better. And the reason why I say that is that I have learned to be more empathic towards myself, and that isn't that easy as it sounds, because we don't even know how we feel sometimes, because we are also reacting via and because of stereotypes that we have in our minds.
Yeah, absolutely. Self-awareness is so helpful because the more data you have about yourself, then the easier it is to describe to people how you communicate or what's hard for you. We had an inverse visceral reaction with me and Scott, where I like to externally process ideas. So I would be like, what if we did this? That kind of thing. Traditional brainstorming. And, I would start going and then Scott would interrupt me, just like I had interrupted him. And he would say, well, actually, and that triggered a visceral reaction in me in the same way that you got a sec. And he was like, what did I do? And I'm like, I feel like you're trying to make me look stupid. I know that my software development skills, like being able to understand the syntax and like sit down and write an application by myself, are way less developed than yours. And I feel like when you say that, you're trying to point it out, and I'm taking it as shame that I don't belong. And then it's triggering this imposter syndrome. And then I just like want to leave. But knowing that and being able to say that, and then he was like, that's actually not what I'm doing at all. I think your ideas are great. And because I have this experience, I want to make sure you're not wasting time on something that I already have learned is not going to pan out the way you want. So I'm attempting to do this compassionately and show you that I care. And so this is what ends up happening is we have these mismatched mental models. So when we can solve those problems that are right in front of us, so what we did, and a lot of times when you have this creating, I call it a communication protocol. So similar to how we send information, we've got TCP, IP, and UDP and like all that stuff, but it depends on the situation. So for this one, what we did was Scott would interrupt. He would say, pause. Do you want macro feedback, micro feedback, or no feedback? And be like, I kind of just want to process this and let me know if something is way off base and I, would look like an idiot. But there's other times where I'm like, this is ready to go out. I'm getting ready to ship this. Please, please, please use your amazing detail, eagle eye to pull it apart because I'm ready for that. I've figured out enough of the details. So again, that's that I don't have enough information. So putting together that protocol and just we've developed hundreds of these. And I think this is the idea is that a lot of times when we're talking about Agile or Scrum or things, the rules tend to feel like they are imposed, even though in every single book about Agile methodologies and frameworks, there is some kind of clause where it is start here. If it doesn't work, modify it. It needs to work for your team. People gloss over that and, introduce dogma instead.
So,
I
think that this is the point in the conversation where I think we need to take it to the empathy between the teams and, of course, Scrum Masters and their leaders, because you're bringing up so many topics related to this different expectations and, let's face it, different realities. I mean, yourself, you're a software executive, and you know how different the type of challenges and problems and ideas that you need to deal with are from the teams who are actually delivering software. Yeah. So can you give us some ideas, some thoughts, some experiences you have learned about enabling that empathy between the teams doing the software and the leaders who, of course, need to lead the organization?
Yeah. Yeah. And so this is another model from the book that I think is really helpful too. So first we need to identify what's the goal state. What do we want to achieve? And we got there with Corgi Bites where it was this magical, like agile, like all this stuff was just working and we were shipping stuff and people loved working with each other. And like we had a really healthy culture. Like we've been there. So that's what we want. We want an optimized system where we're delivering value. And value can be measured in whatever your domain is. But in software, typically the way I think of it is how quickly can we go from intention to implementation? Which is, I see that this needs to happen. how quickly can we deploy it and make it a reality? And so that's kind of a general metric that we can use to kind of measure, technical health. So that's where we want to go. And that is a high functioning team. And it exists in this place of coordination, is what I call it. But then we have two other states. We have confrontation, where we're spending the majority of our time just dealing with stress and strain. And that stress and strain can come from our internal, selves. It can come from, I don't like working with you because you think differently from me, or it can come from working with the system itself. Like we have had so many, like this test suite takes 19 hours to run. We know that if you spent just a little bit more money, we could get it down to, at least less than an hour, and your company would save so much money. But then being able to sell that idea, it's really hard, right? And it takes people a really long time. So then, you feel frustrated because you don't feel like you've got that power. So I think the biggest thing for Scrum Masters is there's a pattern of gatekeeper that was established very, very early on in, how we do, I think it was James Kupling. And I think that we need to get rid of that. I think
Can you
we
explain
need to
that
instead have
pattern?
it as an advocate role.
Can you explain that pattern just for those of us who are not familiar, the pattern of the gatekeeper?
So this was developed in the late 90s, kind of when the Agile movement was first starting. It came from the patterns community. And the idea is software developers don't really have the skills to talk to, business people themselves. So we need to have a Scrum Master, a role that is the gatekeeper, that is the one point of contact where they talk to the business people and then it gets interpreted back. And I think that's very disempowering as a framing, because I think it feeds into this stereotype of if you're good with machines, you are bad with people. And that's a false dichotomy. I find that in software, especially legacy systems, some of the most kind, compassionate, and frankly, really good communicators are there, but they don't see themselves that way because they don't conform to this pseudo psychic, I can read your emotions and know exactly what you feel. And no, but they ask really great follow-up questions. They come with humility. They're trying to make things explicit. And I think that the role that I have always taken for my team when I'm interfacing with, it's as an advocate and not a gatekeeper, where I care very deeply about the developer's experience, because I know that when developers are happy and when they're productive, the business is going to be able to achieve their goals. And so, really trying to describe the needs or position things more as here are the benefits, or framing things where, I know what it's like to be somebody on the business side and be told some of the agile, fail fast. That was one where I'm what? No, we want to pay our mortgage. We don't want to fail. That was one that took me a long, long time. So being able to just add some nuance there, but it's always to advocate for developers being able to do a great job and remove impediments. But that's one pattern I've seen, that some Scrum Masters can take that idea of being the gatekeeper, and when we position it that way, it can bring a lot of ego because there's an inherent power dynamic. But yeah,
and also the imposter syndrome, right? I mean, we have a lot of Scrum Masters in the industry today that are not expert developers, either because of choice, background, or just because they've left coding so long ago and they haven't kept in touch. Being a people person does take time and effort, and a lot of learning goes into it as well. We should recognize that. And it sounds to me that what you're saying is, okay, so your role is not to know what the developers need better than they do.
Yes.
Your role is to talk to them and get them to express what they need, so that you can link the business needs and the developers' needs through conversation with the executives.
Yes. And if you are able to facilitate where everybody comes together, like I think event storming is a great example of this from the domain-driven design world. I think Alberto Brandolini talks about this, where you're getting everybody in a room and saying, hey, what are we all talking about? Like, what are everybody's needs? So I think it's when we use these gatekeeping patterns and we silo and we create impermeable boundaries where it's, no, I'm a tester, and so I don't interface with you. In a workshop that I gave, there was a tester who was like really frustrated with their developer, because we start this with like, find a pebble in the shoe problem, similar like me being an overrep, or like it's just this thing that is annoying, but it happens over and over again. And when it does, it impedes your productivity, right? So how can you fix that? So walking through an exercise, the developer realized, or the test engineer there realized, that they were creating really long test reports in a way to help themselves feel like if anything went wrong, it was kind of a CYA approach, right? Totally normal. But that was driven out of fear. And the frustration came that the developer kept missing details. And so the test engineer was just like, they don't care. Right? So a technical understanding of this is, oh, that's the fundamental attribution bias. It's something that pretty much all of us succumb to, not a bad thing. We need to balance that bias. The fundamental attribution bias is when something happens to me, I blame it on my circumstances. When something happens to somebody else that is negative, I blame it on their character flaws. So he was like, I'm writing all of these, detailed reports, but like this person's lazy. So then it's like, okay, well, what are the character things that are showing up for you? And then what are their situations? So just walking through it, it's like, one of the big ones is contempt. Do you think you're better than this person? He's like, well, I am better than this person. And then literally as soon as the words left his mouth and he heard himself say, he was like, I don't actually believe that. Oh my gosh. So then was able to see, oh, this person has ADHD and they have a really demanding boss. They're not going to be able to parse all of this information. I'm not providing it in a way that's going to be helpful. So came up with an idea and said, hey, developer I work with every day, I don't think the way that again, this is an accountability framing. I don't think the way I'm creating the test plans is as productive as it could be. And my hypothesis is they're not fun for you to implement. I have an idea. What if I recorded a video and then I will make timestamps of the places where I think you really need to pay attention? Would that be something that would be better on your end? And so we're solving problems together. This is where we collaborate. So that's the other side of it. So we can go from confrontation to collaboration. So we've got confrontation, coordination, collaboration. But we can also stay in collaboration too long, where all we do is deliberate ideas and then we won't actually get anything done. So the way we optimize the system is we then implement some kind of adaptation from that. Like, okay, let's experiment. Like, this is where all the experimentation comes in. So it creates kind of, I call it the restore and explore cycle, where when we are feeling frustrated, like we can go from collaboration where our stress response can become really activated, similar to when like I got interrupted with, well, actually, right? Then we know, oh, I'm activated. We can then restore. So this is where psychological safety comes in. This is where having health and well-being and like being able to stop, pause and take a beat. Then we can look at the system again through coordination, which is just like, okay, what is the system as it is? Then we can move into collaboration, which is figuring out ideas that we can optimize the system. And if we implement a successful adaptation, we move towards high functioning. And it's this process of doing this over and over and over and over again. The more people who use this collect, connect, communicate, kind of that's just the way they navigate their day, high functioning teams kind of emerge from
And
that.
that's really what I think we as Scrum Masters and Agile coaches can bring to the table together with the executives, because let's not forget that software executives have a big
Yep.
role to play in enabling
Yeah.
a lot of the solutions or adaptations, as you call them, that we want to try out, to experiment with. So, Andrea, we're getting close to the end, but I didn't want to go before I ask you, because you're also an author, and we'll link to Andrea's book, Empathy Driven Software Development, in the show notes. So make sure to check it out. But as a software executive, not as an author, but appreciating what books can do for people, as you are an author as well. As a software executive, what was the book that most influenced you, and why?
Yeah. Team of Teams. I had been struggling mightily with understanding just the core concepts of Agile. And it was hard for me. It was a big ego. Well, I mean, I went to business school to learn how to run businesses. And I was hired for my expertise on how to run businesses. And I kept getting frustrated because, like, no, we don't do that here. No, that's wrong. Like, and like the fail fast. And I just couldn't figure out the lingo because it was so different than the way I learned. I mean, it is a paradigm shift. So being really patient, I think, with executives, because and respecting that they have a lot of technical knowledge around running businesses, and it's a big leap. I would say it's just as much of a big leap between object-oriented programming and now having to learn AI. It's like, what's all this? Like, it was really profound. But when I read Team of Teams, I think it was just positioned so well. And I think it's one of the most underrated books about Agile. That's not about Agile. Like, they don't use the term Agile software development anywhere in there. But he talked about the differences between complex and complicated systems. He gave a little bit of, background about Frederick Winslow Taylor and how that was a really great model in the 19th and 20th centuries. But we've since moved. And now that we have all these interdependencies, if we try to use a command and control model, it breaks down. And so I think for me, having a very tangible story around a successful implementation that required a whole organizational shift, it wasn't about the rituals, it was experimentation and a really big focus on effective communication. So that was one where when I read that, I was like, oh, this is what they're talking about. So,
Yeah, absolutely. I love
yeah.
that book also because it is a real story, but it is also a very high stakes story. It's one of
Yeah.
those where you would think, oh, nobody can fail. We should plan this very, very well. But what General McChrystal found out is that planning was keeping them from evolving, from learning, and from being able to react to the threats that they were dealing with. And they had to go back and become a complete team of teams, very adaptive and very experimental to be able to deal with the threats that they had to face.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like the other big thing is the communication infrastructure. That's something I think people absolutely overlook, which is what's the plumbing that is going to enable information to spread throughout your organization. And being very the other thing that he talked about in that book was the difference between Apollo and how that space program was managed, and Challenger. And Challenger was much more command and control, but in Apollo they had what they called like communication loops. So you could just pick up a telephone and it was just an ongoing conversation, and so you could just like ping anybody who happened to be on that. I was like, oh, that's like Slack. That's like Slack. That's the value of Slack, is we make communications public. So then that way there's more visible information, and we make it so that people aren't bottlenecks and they can quickly, but you have to structure it in a very intentional way. I sometimes say, especially for remote teams, you need to be as intentional with your communication infrastructure, which is the channels, how you use email, what your protocols are, like all of that. the tools you use, you need to be just as intentional about that as you are with how a physical layout is, because that is your office. And if you just leave it and like let it organize itself, you're going to have huge problems.
Yeah, I really like the phrase, you need to be intentional about how you set it up, because there's no experimentation without intentionality. Otherwise, it's just chaos, right?
Yeah.
Andrea, it's been a pleasure. We're unfortunately running out of time. I could be here the whole day talking about these topics with you. But if people want to know more about you and the work that you're doing, we'll put the link to the book on the show notes for sure. But where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So right now, I'm most active on LinkedIn. I've kind of don't publish on a lot of other social media platforms these days. And I have a newsletter. I can give you the link so you can have it in the show notes. But that's where I'm kind of like pre-publishing and vetting. That's my beta test for some of the ideas. So that is a great place. And then if you wanted to engage in the comments and stuff, that's always super useful. So yeah, that's where it's like, I'm exploring, empathy is a stereotype, or, I think there's a lot here between object-oriented programming and the constructed theory of emotion. Like, just if I have interesting insights, I'll put it there. But yeah, it's looking at empathy in a technical way and not just saying it's some magical skill, because that's not what the evidence shows.
And we do need that, because we need the tools to be able to work with and exhibiting empathy. Andrea, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh boy, I bet you are buzzing with ideas after listening to this episode. I know I was. Now, there are so many ways we can help the leaders we work with, so I hope this episode helped you get some of those ideas going and getting inspired, hopefully also to take action. That's what matters in the end, don't forget that. Now, if you want to check out the key lessons from this episode, check out the show notes at scrummastertoolbox.org. But for now, I'll say goodbye and see you in the next episode.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.